my sort of first impressions were probably based around the enormous range of abilities that people had. And I don't think I had any concept of what mental handicap, it was called then, learning disabilities was, until several months after that I worked in the hospital. I started in the hospital block, and we had a range of people from Glasgow flyboy in particular, who lived in the hospital, sort of went and stayed some weekends with relatives, pinched what he could out the shops and the bars, and came back in and tried to sell you.
I could name that person.
So he was a resident in the same ward that quite a number of people who were quadriplegic, blind and perhaps deaf.
And often described as Owain.
And weighed about 3 stone, who needed absolute total nursing care. Another guy in the same place would go and work in the farm during the day and come back in and sleep there at night. A guy next to the small person with severe disabilities was a soldier in the First World War who had the Spanish flu in 1918 and got encephalitis of some sort, and he ended up in the castle for a long number of years.
There was a raft of people who that flew and left some kind of post-viral condition. There was a raft of people. There was also a raft specifically of ladies, and I only discovered the ladies of the hospital when I returned as a charge nurse and took charge of a female ward, who they were there on the basis of being defined as moral defective, and they had no more a learning disability than you or I, and there were some, and by the time I was working there, they were old ladies, and they were lovely old ladies, but they did not have a learning disability.
The bizarre range of abilities and characters and experience, that was alluring in many ways, coupled, I think, with the maternalism of quite a lot of the women, the nursing assistants I worked with. It was not an extended family that you'd ever want to acknowledge, but so many people that I didn't know said, "Oh, aye, you're Margaret Mitchell. So I remember your granny was like that," And suddenly there were all these people who knew you, knew your relatives, knew who you were, and there was no place at all that you went in the hospital that somebody didn't know of you. No,
absolutely. And I think, but I suspect that's pretty the same in any small community, and arguably the hospital was a small community of its own. I mean, I think you and I probably learned very quickly in a small village like Lennox Town is that you don't say anything about anybody, because you're sure as eggs is eggs, you'll be talking to somebody's cousin. I think you did develop particular fondnesses for individuals. I tell the story, and actually I tell it ad nauseum, and I still tell it, is about a young man who was around now. Peter passed away a few years ago. Was a wee red-haired mop guy with Down syndrome, and Peter had very limited verbal communication. He could swear very well, but he was quite businesslike, but also he was quite comedic. Unfortunately, he had a bit of a temper, and I think many of the other patients in the ward would purchase upon that, because it was probably slightly more entertaining than the black and white television that was sitting in the corner. Later on in my professional life, I met him again, and had the privilege of knowing him once he'd left hospital, and once he was living back near his family in Argyll and Bute, and he was a delightful man. I could name lots and lots of names, but I do think that I think so many of the folk who lived in Lennox Castle were incredibly resilient individuals, and had a far greater strength of character than we often give folk credit for, and also were you know, highly intelligent and talented, but in different ways to you and I. I don't know if you remember a gentleman called George. I can't remember George's second name, but George lived in one of the wards. And it happened to be a ward that actually had a piano in the day hall. And George was described to me initially as a low grade. That was the terminology that was used, which meant that there was somebody who we would describe now as having a very complex learning disability. But George had a savant as well. He had in fact even more than one savant. He had considerable numbers of savants. So you could give George 7 numbers, and then you could give him another 7 numbers, and he would give you back 14 numbers, which was the multiple thereof. Also, if you played a tune on the radio, if the radio was on or the television was on, George could go up to the piano and he could pick up the tune, and he could pick it up absolutely pitch perfect. And he just thought, oh my goodness, you know, that's what's going on. And yet, this was a man who lived most of his life in a moleskin suit. You'll remember them, Mitch. He was a man who was deemed as having to be fed. Why, I never knew. And he was clearly had talents which belied that in entirety. Certainly my thinking was, you know, if this was my brother or sister, would I want them to be managed in such a way? And the answer to that would probably be no.